The latest on the fate of two American prisoners being held there, our senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim spoke to Mickey Bergman, the vice president and executive director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, who is directly involved in negotiations to free Brittney Griner and Paul Wheelan from Russia, despite the war in Ukraine. He asked Bergman, who represents the families of those detained there, about the American and Russian strategies here. Let's take a listen.
February, at the end of February, actually, the eve of the war, Governor Richardson and myself were in Moscow at the invitation of the Russians. We met with the Russian leadership to discuss Paul Wheelan and Trevor Reed. That was before Brittney Griner was actually, or at least it wasn't known that she's detained. And we came back with clear ideas of what the Russians were willing to do and what the deal that they wanted to do. And we went back and we presented to the White House. None of it was groundbreaking. It's things that we've discussed with the Russians and the White House have discussed with the Russians before. But what was interesting at that moment is that the Russians were still saying that deal is on the table, even despite the war that was raging at that point in Ukraine. And we were trying to push. Trevor Reed also had active tuberculosis. So we put, we said there's urgency in this. And we worked very closely with the Reed family and Jonathan Franks, who represented them, made sure that they met with the president, and then applied our own pressure and our conversations with the president, basically to push towards making that urgent deal in spite of the war and the conflict between the countries. Now, that gives me hope that it's doable to do it again from that perspective. But there's a lot of moving parts here. This is, we now have, everybody's talking about the two major cases, Paul Wheelan and Brittney Griner. There are other Americans being held in Russia. It's a bigger issue. And there is not only the issue of the prisoners. Of course, President Putin is looking at it. He's looking at the impact that this has on Biden. He has his own agendas. Biden is looking at it from a political perspective as well. It's just very, very complicated. And the key is to just find the overlap between the two sides at the right moment and push for it and to see that it happens.
How do you make, obviously your number one priority is to bring those prisoners, essentially those hostages, back. That's what they are in the end, as hostages. How do you make the case where we're going to trade you one of the world's most notorious arms dealers for somebody who got caught with a few grams of marijuana? How do you kind of negotiate that when they're not equal in any measure?
Yeah, so on this, I have to say, it's a difficult thing to look, but it's really important for your audience to understand this. These deals, these exchanges, they're not just. They're not just. It's not about a justice exchange. You're looking at a convicted criminal versus people who are wrongfully detained. Even if Brittney Griner confessed to actually having a little bit of, have to think about it as a hostage confession almost in this, but obviously not equal. So this is not about justice. This is a political deal. And the important thing to understand about this, I think, for the audience is these Americans, and there are, we're talking about Russia here, but there's almost 70 Americans being held around the world now, wrongfully detained, defined by the US government. They're held mainly because they are Americans. So we have an obligation to do what needs to happen, what needs to be done in order to bring them home. In other words, the deal is, it's not a good one. It's not a fun one. Nobody likes it. It's not just, but it is the right thing to do for these Americans, for their families, and for our nation. And as for the people who claim that it might make more Americans vulnerable making those deals, I would argue two things. First of all, the data doesn't support that. The deterrence factor doesn't come from the deal you make. It comes from your behavior after a deal is made. And actually, if you look back at one of the leading countries in this is Israel, in the way they will make the deals. They will do what needs to be done to bring back Israelis. But then anybody that has been involved in the kidnapping knows that there's a target on their head for the rest of their lives. And that's where deterrence comes.